Hello, and welcome to Lesson 1 on joints. In this lesson, we will introduce you to the three major types of joints and spend a little time describing the anatomy of synovial joints. In the context of human anatomy, a joint is an articulation, also known as an arthrosis. So wherever you see the root arthro, think joint. A joint is a point of contact between two bones. Joints also are present where bone meets cartilage or where bone meets the teeth, as in the jaws. We will look at examples of each of those in the next few slides. The purpose of joints is to allow for movement. Bones are too rigid to bend and allow for movement on their own, so we are designed to have movement and the spaces between the bones or the articulations. In this chapter, we will introduce the various types of joints in the body. We will classify them both anatomically and physiologically, or by structure and function. And we will spend a bit of time looking at the types of movements that can be carried out at joints, focusing mainly on synovial joints. So joints can be classified based on their structure. This includes fibrous joints, where the bones are held together by dense collagen fibers. We also have cartilaginous joints, where the bones are held together by cartilage. And the most abundant type of joints in the body are the synovial joints, where the bones are held together by ligaments, and synovial joints have a joint cavity. These are the ones you probably think of when you think of joints that allow for free movement. But technically, where bones are held together, even by fibrous tissue, that may not allow for a lot of movement, that is still a joint, that's a fibrous joint. And when the bones are held together by cartilage, again, not a lot of movement may occur, if any, but that is still a joint. Now, functionally, joints can be classified by the amount of movement that is allowed between the bone and the articulating structure. A synarthrosis is an immovable joint. The bones come together and are held rigid in place, and there is no movement between those bones. An example of that would be a suture. A suture is a fibrous synarthrotic joint that allows for no movement between the skull bones. We'll look at examples of these going forward. Another joint type is the amphioarthrosis. This is a slightly movable joint. So this occurs, for example, in the pubic symphysis, which is a cartilaginous joint that allows for a little bit of movement in the pelvic region. Diarthrosis or diarthrosis is a freely movable joint. There are varying degrees of movement, but compared to the others, a diarthrosis is a freely movable joint. All synovial joints are diarthroses. All diarthroses are synovial joints. However, synarthroses and amphioarthroses can be either fibrous or cartilaginous. Let's look at some examples. Fibrous joints lack a synovial cavity, and the bones are held closely together by dense, irregular connective tissue. Some fibrous joints allow for little movement, making them amphioarthrotic, while some allow for no movement, making them synarthrotic. We mentioned sutures. Sutures are the joints between the skull bones. They allow for no movement. So a suture is a synarthrotic fibrous joint. In this example, we have the coronal suture between the frontal bone and the parietal bones. Another fibrous joint is the interosseous membrane, which we noted in previous lessons is located between the tibia and the fibula of the leg, as well as between the radius and ulna of the forearm. Interosseous membranes allow for slight movement, so they are amphioarthrotic. Please do not get caught up in the other designations and definitions of these joints, such as the syndesmosis noted in the caption for this image. Just stick with the main terms that I am describing to you. Our last example of a fibrous joint is the periodontal ligament. These are the fibrous tissues that hold teeth in place within the jaws. I must reiterate that teeth are not skeletal structures. Teeth are organs of the digestive system. However, anatomically, the teeth are associated with bone as they fit into the sockets of the alveolar processes of the maxilla and the mandible. In a healthy individual, periodontal ligaments are immovable joints. I hope that's the case for you, that your teeth are not wiggling around in your jaws. All right, so periodontal ligaments are synarthrotic fibrous joints. To reiterate, we have the sutures in the skull, which are synarthrotic fibrous joints. We have the interosseous membrane between the forearm and leg bones, which is an amphioarthrotic fibrous joint. And here we have the periodontal ligament, which is a synarthrotic immovable fibrous joint. Let's move on to the cartilaginous joints. Like the fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints lack a synovial cavity. So you can already imagine that there's going to be little to no movement at these joints. So some are, again, synarthrotic, some are amphioarthrotic. They are cartilaginous joints because the bone and the associated structure are held tightly together by either hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage. On this slide, we have two examples. The epiphyseal plate that holds the epiphysis to the diaphysis in long bones is technically a cartilaginous joint. So their hyaline cartilage attaches these two regions of bone to form the entire long bone. That is an immovable or synarthrotic joint. In the diagram below, we have the pelvic region where the two pubis bones of the coccyx meet anteriorly at the pubic symphysis joint. As we've heard before, this is a amphioarthrotic or slightly movable joint. So it's an amphioarthrotic cartilaginous joint. As we described on the previous slide, the epiphyseal or growth plate is a band of hyaline cartilage that attaches the epiphysis to the diaphysis. So two bone regions meet together at this cartilaginous joint. That is immovable, so it is a synarthrotic cartilaginous joint. The pubic symphysis between the two hip bones is an amphioarthrotic cartilaginous joint. And in the diagram to the right here, we have depicted the intervertebral disc, which is a joint between the vertebrae. And it is made up of fibrocartilage. It is slightly movable and allows for flexibility and movement within the vertebral column. So the intervertebral joints or intervertebral discs are amphioarthrotic cartilaginous joints. We are now moving into synovial joints, which represent the largest class of joints. Synovial joints are the ones you probably think of whenever you think of joints because they allow free movement. All synovial joints are diarthrotic. So this includes your knee joint, elbow joint, shoulder joint, hip joint, the interphalangeal joints, the intercarpal joints, even that atlanto-occipital joint between your skull and the first cervical vertebra, that is a synovial joint. These joints allow for large amounts of movement because they have a synovial cavity. There's an actual space between the articulating bones. Synovial joints contain synovial fluid. So this fluid fills the synovial cavity. It lubricates the bone ends, provides shock absorption, and reduces friction. Other functions of synovial fluid we will discuss on a future slide. Synovial joints have a nerve supply, so they are innervated. And this innervation provides information to the brain about the position of your joints in space, right? So the position of your body, essentially. Also information about stress on the joints, activity at the joints, even injury at the joints. Synovial joints are also vascularized. They have a blood supply. And this blood supply, in part, is responsible for the production of synovial fluid. The outer boundary of the joint is defined by connective tissues that make up the articular capsule. The bones at synovial joints are covered with articular cartilage at the ends where they come together. Also note that the bones are held together in place by bands of dense regular connective tissue, ligaments. We'll look at this anatomy on the next slide, and we'll further discuss the functions of all of these anatomical features. But put together, the anatomy of a synovial joint permits a large range of movement, and that is why they are called diarthrotic joints. Here we have a diagram of a frontal section through a synovial joint. Hopefully you can identify the two articulating bone ends. So this is the spongy bone of the epiphyses, and in light blue, deep in the diagram, we have the articular hyaline cartilage that covers the bone ends. Lateral and extending from the cartilage is the synovial membrane, and this is a loose connective tissue that makes up the inner lateral border of the joint cavity. Superficial to the synovial membrane is a fibrous membrane. So this is dense connective tissue that surrounds the synovial membrane and inserts into the periosteum of the articulating bones. Together, the fibrous membrane and the deeper synovial membrane make up the articular or joint capsule and limits the space between the bones. In yellow there is identified the synovial or joint cavity, and this is the space that contains that synovial fluid. We will look at the functions of each of these structures on the next slide, but reference this diagram when discussing those functions. Not shown on this diagram, but definitely present, are the ligaments that also extend from the periosteum of the articulating bones. The ligaments are superficial to the articular capsule, and the ligaments hold the bones together in addition to the articular capsule. On the bottom right, we have a cadaver view of an actual synovial joint. So the joint cavity is not necessarily a big space, but it does allow for free movement between the articulating bones. So let's now specify the functions of the structures that we saw on the diagram of the synovial joint. We notice that the joint has a joint cavity that allows the bones to be freely movable to varying degrees. The ligaments that are the most superficial structure at a joint hold the bones together and are continuous with the periosteum. Ligaments, along with the shape of the articulating surfaces and other accessory structures, help to define the joint and the type of motion that is allowed. So we will see some joints and see the arrangements of the ligaments that again contribute to the shape and the amount of motion that occurs at a particular joint. We met the articular capsule, which is a sleeve-like capsule that encloses the synovial cavity. It is composed of two layers. We saw the more superficial fibrous capsule, which is dense connective tissue. It is continuous with the periosteum and defines the superficial lateral borders of the joint. Deep to the fibrous capsule, we have the inner synovial membrane, which forms the inner lateral borders of the joint cavity. Again, it's made of loose connective tissue that is highly vascularized, and the blood vessels within that synovial membrane produce the synovial fluid that fills the joint cavity. Also note that the synovial membrane extends into or is continuous with the articular cartilage that covers the bone ends. The synovial fluid is very important. It is produced by the synovial membrane, it fills the joint cavity, and the synovial fluid has several functions. Number one, it reduces friction by lubricating the joint. So it acts as a lubricant. It also absorbs shock, especially in those weight-bearing joints. The synovial fluid is produced from blood plasma, so it contains oxygen and nutrients that are supplied to the cartilage. Hopefully you recall that cartilage is avascular, but this tissue is under a lot of stress and wear and tear. So the cartilage cells are supplied with oxygen and nutrients that diffuse out of the synovial fluid into the cartilage. Finally, the synovial fluid helps to remove carbon dioxide and metabolic wastes from the cartilage. I must also mention that the cartilage is nourished by the diffusion of oxygen and nutrients from blood vessels in the bone tissue that the cartilage covers. So the cartilage is supplied by oxygen and nutrients from the blood vessels in the bone, as well as oxygen and nutrients from the synovial fluid in the joint cavity. In addition to the basic structures that make up a synovial joint, which we identified on the previous slides, some joints also have accessory ligaments, articular discs, and other accessory structures. The accessory ligaments include the extracapsular ligaments. These are ligaments located outside of the articular capsule and include the tibial and fibular collateral ligaments of the knee joint. I have provided a diagram on the next slide so you can see where these are located. Some joints also have intracapsular ligaments. So these ligaments lie deep to the articular capsule but are excluded from the synovial cavity itself by folds of the synovial membrane. Examples are the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments of the knee joint. You may have heard of the ACL. This ligament is often torn in athletes, such as football and basketball players, who experience sudden, sharp, lateral movements of the knee. So your knee is designed as a hinge joint to kick out for extension and pull back during flexion. Your knee is not supposed to move off to the side. So if it does experience forces that cause that type of movement, it can tear these ligaments. Some joints also have articular discs, also known as menisci or menisci. One is a meniscus. These are pads of cartilage that lie between the articular surfaces of the bone and help to divide the synovial cavity into two spaces so that each can experience its own separate movement. The menisci also allow bones of different shapes to fit better together at a joint, and these discs help to absorb shock and distribute the weight across a greater contact surface. On this slide, I have provided two diagrams of the knee. You are not responsible for these diagrams. You do not have to label them or identify any of the parts. I just wanted to give you a visual of what we were describing with respect to the accessory structures at joints. So on the left, we have an anterior deep view of the knee joint, which again is formed by the femur and the tibia. The patella has been removed. On the left, we have labeled the anterior cruciate ligament. As you can see, it is a deep intracapsular ligament that attaches the femur to the tibia. Between these two bones, we have the lateral and medial menisci. All right, and these again help the bones to fit better together and help to distribute the weight at the joint. We have two collateral ligaments, which are extracapsular ligaments. On the left, the fibular collateral ligament is labeled. At the bottom right, we have the tibial collateral ligament. On the diagram to the right, we have a sagittal section through the knee showing you the muscles that span the knee joint. The patella is identified. And also note the structures called bursae. One is a bursa. The bursa are sacs of synovial fluid that lie underneath tendons and ligaments and help to reduce friction at joints. As illustrated on the previous slide, bursae are sac-like structures containing a fluid very similar to synovial fluid. Bursae are located between tendons, ligaments, and bones They may also be located between the skin and bones. These bursae, one is a bursa, function to cushion the movements of these body parts and to reduce friction. You may have heard of bursitis, which is an acute or chronic inflammation of a bursa, often caused by irritation from repeated or excessive exertion of a joint. It may also be caused by trauma or even infections. So it's treated with anti-inflammatories. Finally, we have our tendon sheaths or synovial sheaths. And tendon sheaths are tube-like structures that wrap around certain tendons that are exposed to excessive friction. So you have tendon sheaths, for example, around the tendons that attach the heads of the biceps and triceps femoris muscles at the shoulder. So they are other structures that reduce friction.